Good afternoon and good morning, everybody, and thank you again for joining us. We do have a number of people still logging in, but we're going to get started right away because we have a good bit of material to cover. Today's presentation, today's webinar is titled A Holistic Approach to Cybersecurity. And without further ado, I will turn this over to Steve Racing, CEO of ASMGi, as well as Frank Yako, CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives at ASMGi, and they will take you through the presentation. Just a quick reminder to everyone, use the Ask a Question box in the lower left-hand corner. We will get to your questions during the presentation and at the end at the Q&A session. So without further ado, Steve, take it away.
Great, thank you, Paul, and thank you to everyone for sharing some of your time with us today. I am Steve Racing, the CEO of ASMGi, and I'm joined today by Frank Yako, our CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives.
Hi, Steve.
Thanks for being here, Frank.
Thanks for having me.
So we're very excited about today's topic. We have a great topic, a holistic approach to cybersecurity, and we do have a lot of material today. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to start with a question. So what if there was a way to develop your cyber program such that the business understands what you're going to implement, when you're going to implement, and probably more importantly, why you are implementing solutions? What if you could determine what an appropriate budget is for the enterprise versus like being told every year, here's your budget, go fix every problem that we have, right? So what if you could determine what an appropriate budget was for your enterprise to help protect the organization? And lastly, what if each implemented solution not only achieves a return on its own, but it also works well with the solutions that you have in place, the existing solutions, and contributes really to a larger ecosystem or feeds a larger ecosystem, and net the whole then becomes greater than the sum of the parts. So that's really the premise, I think, to holistic security from our perspective. And the good news is that with a holistic approach, those things are possible. They're very doable. And so when we look at a holistic approach to cybersecurity, we often talk at ASMGi about a total solution. It's truly a people plus process plus technology. And this isn't a new concept. Frank's been around for a while. I think you've heard this before. Most of the people, I think, have probably heard people, process, technology.
Yeah, and it's hard to sometimes when you're fighting the day-to-day battles to keep that in mind, but there's no doubt that without all three of those components, you don't have a total solution.
Right. So the other way that we try to look at the holistic approach to cyber is, and a total solution in general, is really three pillars. There's a program that needs to be in place, and this really defines the corporate objectives and what outcomes your initiative should achieve and those types of things, but also SLAs and various different elements of the program, and that technology piece or platform to be deployed. But then there's also the operations, right? Being able to take this platform and to solve a problem, you need to fully operationalize it and integrate it and adopt it into the enterprise. And so we see a lot of challenges there. But really two ways to look at it, I think, from a total solution standpoint. The people, process, technology really equates to a three-pillar approach of program, technology, and operations. So, that said, holistic information security is really a way of thinking. And, one of the things that we look at are, the two different ways that you can really approach a problem. One is the point solution mindset. And I see this actually quite often in many enterprises, the fragmented approach and a focus on technology, right? So how many times have you been asked to deploy a solution and just really not been able to get your arms around the why aspect of it and really take the time to address those elements of a holistic total solution, right? The three pillars and the people, process, and technology. And I think the point solution mindset is characteristic of that. So we see this in a lot of enterprises. A lot of times it's a reaction to something, right? So, unfortunately, the CEO might be driving in the morning and listening to the NPR and hearing all about WikiLeaks. That's it's a classic example, but like DLP solutions were a very popular thing to deploy in the enterprise when WikiLeaks, really proliferated and data started exfiltrating companies and governments and various different things, and then it showed up in a public place, right? Everybody's like, "Whoa, hold the bus. We need to put DLP in so that doesn't happen." And
there's so much hype out there too of the whole fear, uncertainty, doubt, FUD that the vendors or the solution providers interject into the mix as well, and making you feel that if you don't have their solution in place, that you have a huge gap in your overall portfolio as well.
Yep.
So that it's hard to sort through that at times as you try to put together that overall program.
Right. So some of the providers of technology are not afraid to create some of the hype and the fear and uncertainty and doubt that you speak of in order to drive those types of things. And then the other thing I like to look at from a point solution mindset is like this is what the business wants right now, right? And it isn't necessarily in the company's best interest, but it's what they want right now. And so we'll contrast that to a holistic mindset, right? In a holistic mindset, we're focusing on solutions, and again, total solutions being people, process, and technology, which kind of aligns with that three pillar approach. The other thing worth pointing out is that, to me, a holistic mindset is really, it's gap-based and it's also risk-based. And what I mean by that, and we've had this conversation internally, everything is gap-based, right? Here's where I am today. Here's where I want to be tomorrow or next week or next quarter or next year. And here are the gaps, right? Here's what's preventing me from being there today. So these are the things, you can turn that into a task list or what have you, but filling those gaps are how you create initiatives, right?
Right, yeah, unless you define that end goal, you never know whether you're doing the things that you need to achieve that future state as well.
Right. And risk-based by default, in my opinion, if a risk-based approach is really, it's cost versus benefit, right? If the cost of, mitigating or remediating a risk is more than the cost of the risk, then why would you spend money on that initiative? But
it all should be aligned to how your organization's threat profile is and the risk that
right.
you are actually encountering based on your business.
Right.
And that's the hard thing when you're just looking at a solution is it's not really clear whether that aligns to your business problem or not.
Yep. And so there you go. The next bullet item is aligning with the business. And this, in a true holistic mindset, it's not a fragmented approach and it's not a knee-jerk reaction to something. It's truly a strategic response, and you take the time to really make sure that you're understanding the business. And so the way I sum that up is, it's what the business needs for the longer term. So, and that equates a lot of times, hopefully over time to what the business wants, right? You're hopefully achieving those objectives, but it's more importantly is what the business needs. And I think that, we're all in the same business when it comes to that, right? It's hard to really understand a lot of times or help people understand what they truly need, but everybody seems to know what they want in the moment, right?
Right.
So along this line, in creating the way of thinking, you could say that a holistic approach to anything is really learning to see the forest and not just the trees, right? So we've all heard this saying, a million times, but I think, holistic in general is really looking at the whole instead of just, part of the problem. So you could say, easily it's about seeing the forest, right? Seeing the whole forest and really understanding how to solve your problem that way. I actually like the metaphor of the, see the trees for the forest kind of thing. But I was looking for an ideal slide that really represented that graphically and had a quote on it and all those other things. I came across this quote by Stephen Covey, and I really like it. And I know the text is a little bit hard to read, so hopefully you can all see this. But it says the key is not to prioritize what's on your schedule, but to schedule your priorities. And to me, this really sums it up, what a holistic approach is all about. You can't just take everything on your plate and try to, put a number on it, right? Priority. The key is really establishing what are your priorities, what are the most important things that you should be focusing your energy on, and then schedule those activities, right? But only those activities. And I really think that is the essence of the thinking that we're trying to create when we talk about a holistic program.
And that's really hard to do when you're getting hammered every day with, a crisis or something that you're reacting to. And so it really comes down to how do you really go about doing that. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest questions that we want to make sure that, we provide some opportunities to answer that today.
Yep. So as we close out this introductory piece, I wanted to close with a question as well, and something that you can all think about, like how do you make decisions at your organization or even in your department or your team, right? Do you look at things holistically, or are you making decisions based on point solutions or reactions to things that are happening around you, or directives from your seniors, right? Are you building roadmaps that are based on risk posture, right, that have outcomes defined like lowering your risk versus budget driven? And kind of the way I view that up is being value-based or cost-based, right? So do you truly evaluate the value of a solution, which is not just the cost, right? What is the value to the enterprise? Or are you driven by cost and following budgets when you build your roadmaps? Do you see the forest or the trees? Quite simply, and to align with Covey's quote, are you trying to prioritize everything? Or are you scheduling only what you determine as a priority? And I think these are, if people can really establish this, I think they can be on the road to a holistic approach and really truly benefit by doing that.
Well, and ultimately too, if you do that, then it does allow you to, when the crises do occur, it allows you to put that all into perspective so that you either know that's something that you're planning for or have planned for, or that it's something that may have changed that for whatever reason you didn't anticipate, and allow you to then determine what type of reaction you have to that.
Yep. So that, the back half of the presentation, I want to make sure that we talk about how you actually do this, right? Because I've been on a lot of webinars, and you could get stuck in that concept piece, and everything can sound really cool and peachy keen and all those things, but how you actually do it. So that we'll spend a little bit of time talking through this, and the way that we approach holistic security is a methodology around quantifying cyber risk, and that I feel like it's important to point out why that's so critical, and I think it's timely and relevant right now in the market. And the reason is people are having a hard time. I don't think the concept of holistic security is new, but point solution thinking is kind of like a spinning wheel, and you can know better and you can want to get off, but it's really hard to jump off of spinning, that spinning wheel. And so what quantifying risk does is it gives you some bullet points that really help align security with the business and start down that path of treating things holistically. And a couple of those things are bringing security closer to the business. And one of the ways, what we really mean by that, and one of the ways that happens is by creating a common language. I think it's paramount that cyber practitioners learn how to speak the language of the business. And in my opinion, to truly embrace a holistic approach, you have to align with the business. And in order to align with the business, you have to speak their language. And I don't think the business is going to get more articulate in cyber. I think cyber is going to need to get more articulate in business. And really what that boils down to is, dollars and cents, right? And so what's interesting about cyber risk is that most types of enterprise risk are already quantified. When, people have a risk register, in disaster recovery and business continuity, there are business impact analyses that, that generally quantify a risk that shows up, and across the risk register, pretty much all enterprise risk assigns some type of value or, monetary number to that. In cyber, not so much, right? It's generally been point solution oriented and reactionary to things that are going on in attack surfaces and various different things.
Well, and that's the thing. It's escalated to the point where that just is not a reasonable model any longer. I mean, the unfortunate part is the bad guys are spending billions and billions of dollars to try to exploit the organizations that do, want to conduct business in this world.
Yep. So what we're showing on this slide, I wanted to just talk through it a little bit, because this is kind of a dashboard that shows you, it shows you a quantified amount of exposure based on various different controls that are in place. And we're going to talk through the methodology to do this a little bit as part of this program. But again, I want to just emphasize the importance of actually taking cyber and being able to explain to the business what your risks are and what your exposures are in terms that the business understands. And lastly, it's about prioritizing and prioritization. And again, it's not always about getting more budget, it's about getting the appropriate amount of budget and building roadmaps that actually align to an economic impact to the business, right? So if you do these things, here's the economic impact to the business. And we want to help our customers, we want to help position you and ourselves to what those impacts are, and really be in a position to take advantage of these things. So if quantified cyber risk is the answer, how do you do a quantified cyber risk assessment? And so here's a list of kind of the steps, and we're going to go through all the details of each one of these steps shortly. But before we do that, I wanted to explain a couple things about our methodology for quantifying cyber risk. And the first thing I think that's worth noting is that we leverage the CIS controls in order to do these assessments. And it's a pretty common framework, but there are hundreds of frameworks, right? And there are compliance requirements, and there probably are hundreds that people standardize on, though, but NIST or ISO or various different things. And then, as you start getting into specific verticals, it could be driven by compliance or regulatory requirements or those kind of things. And privacy, we know, privacy requirements are popping up all over the place and becoming more stringent. One of the reasons why we really like the CIS controls is because they're governed by an international body. So there are cyber experts all over the world, and they change, right? It's a dynamic framework, and they track against the current threat landscape and change priority of controls based on what we're seeing in the wild, right? From a attack surface area. But the other thing is that the controls map pretty easily to all the other frameworks, and so if you leverage a framework internally, we can map these controls. It's pretty straightforward, in other words. And
the other thing is they're very actionable. So as you look at the different categories of basic, foundational, organizational, if anyone's familiar with the controls, they do break down into sub-controls, and those are a combination, like we've talked about, of people, process, and technology. And it's very easy to apply those to the challenges that you may be facing within your organization and understand, again, whether you're meeting those or not. So it really is something that, it's not just talking about generalities. It really gives you the ability to assess how you are or not doing in your initiatives.
Yep. Good point. And this information is all available on the CIS website. They talk about the newest framework and what's special about CIS and how their controls are established and various different things. So this presentation will also be available for everybody afterwards, and all the links are in here if you're not familiar with those sites yourself. But let's get into the details of actually quantifying risk and going through the exercise and the various different steps. So step one is creating a baseline assessment, and this kind of goes back to that gap-based approach, right? So the first step, in my opinion, to any initiative like this is to gain a thorough understanding of where you're at today. And that's what we do with a baseline assessment, right? So our baseline assessment really encompasses two facets. One is questionnaire driven, like some of us have gotten accustomed to as third parties getting questionnaires that we have to answer from our customers and various different things. But we also have an automated assessment that runs, and then we can compare the results of the two and discuss any discrepancies and those kind of things. But any comments, Frank, on the assessment?
Yeah, I mean, and part of this, and again, everyone's probably familiar with it, is the ability to really profile the business. So it has to be something that is, again, applicable to your organization, where you do business, the types of data that you might use to drive the business, the types of technology that you might already have in place. So again, the idea is to make sure that there's a clear understanding of what your current state is, and then if we use the CIS controls as a reference point, then allowing you to compare how that current state aligns to those types of requirements and best practices.
Yep. And then all the data that's garnered from the assessment is fed back into an AI, an artificial intelligence machine learning model as a data point, and then compared to data sets from actual breach data and various different things that's been annotated and massaged and cleansed, I'll say.
Right, and that's probably one of the biggest changes that is occurring, today is, there's no reason why everyone as security or risk practitioners should not be using, the types of capabilities that are out there today. Every business is leveraging some type of AI, machine learning types of solutions. Why shouldn't that, be the case with security and risk, so that you can leverage the information that's out there? We know that there's plenty of disclosure requirements as a result of incidents or breaches occurring, and that's the kind of information that you can leverage to understand, what those potential risks are to your organization as a result of going through an approach like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a couple of things I think are special about this process and the model. One is how to get data into the system, right? So, for example, people who are in highly regulated industries already have to meet compliance requirements and go through a series of assessments and various different things. So we are able to leverage, if you've already done an assessment, for example, and have some of these controls already defined, we're able to leverage that information to help complete these assessments, and we can automate pieces of it. I think the end goal is to make it easy for the customer, right? So how you get the data from, we don't want customers to have to do one more assessment, right? Everybody's already answering a bunch of questionnaires and various different things. And so just being able to get the data in, again, we're trying to make that part simple. But once the data gets in, once we have the data captured, getting it into the model, now it's both, modeling is both an external and outside-in perspective, but also an inside-out perspective. And so as you compare to some of the other things that are going on in the marketplace, I think, like purely an empirical data model that's looking at historical breach data, generally those data sets are relatively incomplete. A lot of people don't report breaches, and they report them incomplete. They don't report all the information, or, believe it or not, or may not be 100% truthful. And all kinds of things. So the quality of the data is questionable, right? So the data needs to be annotated and cleansed and various different things. But also it's only one aspect of it. So the cyber expertise methodology for, risk rating and those kind of things has to play a part in order to really be able to understand what the empirical data is saying and those kind of things. And so what's cool about this is that we're using both of those in the model and kind of bundling it all together. And I think it's pretty unique and special. But net is, so that's the baseline assessment. And so when we're done, and I don't think I included this part, but the screen we showed before, where you actually see the quantified risk next to each control. So every control that we assess, we have an opportunity now to show you what is the actual exposure for that specific control, and what is the total exposure for the organization based on your overall risk posture from the assessment.
Yeah, and part of that process is to allow you to understand both from the perspective of the things that you have implemented. Again, when we talk about the CAS controls, that includes people, process, technology, so it allows you to assess not only your technology or solutions that you've implemented, but also the processes that you may or may not and have in place, as well as policies as well.
Yep. So step 2 is building the roadmap. So once we've completed a baseline assessment, now we understand where you're at, and where we want to get to is an acceptable level of risk, quite honestly, right? So that is the future state that we define, but it can be defined by any organization however they want, right? The future state.
Right. So part of this, and we know that there's nothing that's static in this world because of the challenges that every organization is facing as either you extend your business into different markets or potentially do acquisitions and assume different types of data or risk. The goal is to have a rolling 3-year roadmap that allows you to keep refreshing your model or your profile based on those changing requirements, and ultimately to get to a point where it is sort of evergreen and you have the ability to continue to communicate with the business based on the different business decisions that might be made, or ultimately even in some cases the changing profile of the technology that you might be using to protect your organization. So that's why it has to be an overall roadmap that changes over the course of time.
Yep. And I will point out there are a lot of words on this slide, and the intention isn't to really go through everything, but the bold words on the left, what I really want to point out is that these are the 3 pillars of a total solution that we've identified: the program, implementing the tools, and then operationalizing it. And if you leverage Cubby's premise, basically that you can't prioritize everything on your plate, what we want to accomplish with the quantified risk assessment is being able to easily identify where you get the most economic impact to the business. And this is the language of the business, quite honestly, right? So if you're able to demonstrate to the CFO or the CEO that, look, if we do these things, this is the outcome, right? And that could mean lowering your cyber insurance rate. It could be lowering your, improving your risk posture and lowering your exposure.
Right.
So it's interesting how, it's a logical progression of steps, but it really ties back to fundamental best practices of holistic security, right? That's
and before you switch to the next slide, can't stress enough the operations component of that, because there's a lot of times that organizations will look at the non-recurring costs in a capital acquisition, whether that's for a subscription, but not those recurring costs. And there's plenty of examples of shelfware or solutions that have only been partially implemented, so you never realize the benefits of those.
Right.
And because you don't have the teams to support those and continue to evolve, the uses of how those are applied to the business. So it truly goes back to those 3 pillars and having all those in place to be able to realize the ROI on any type of investment that you make.
Yep, that's a great point, and I can't I can't explain enough that I see a lot of enterprises that address kind of knee-jerk reactions to problems and try to solve them with technology alone, and then they end up sitting in a box somewhere, right? It's so great point in that a true roadmap will show you all of your cost. It's the total cost of not just implementing but actually operating a solution. Right. It's the total solution cost, right? Compared to the economic benefit to doing the initiative, and that is how you set priorities.
Right, as well as the life cycle, because every solution has some type of expected life expectancy, and that roadmap should also include the cost of reassessing that and determining what the next generation of those solutions might need to be as well.
Yep. So let's move to step 3, is actually selecting and implementing the platforms and tools. And one of the key points I like to make here is that it doesn't mean rip and replace everything, right? If you have a tool that is meeting your objectives, and getting you the desired outcomes that you want, keep it, right? Don't throw it away, and build your model around that, right? But considering an ecosystem, I think, is critical when you're looking for tools. So you may have a tool that, like a vulnerability scanner that it does a decent job of identifying vulnerabilities, but it doesn't share data with anybody else. And so it doesn't feed that ecosystem, and you lose that compounding effect and those exponential benefits, I think, that you can gain by, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So it's truly a consideration in the full life cycle, to your point. Where are you at in that life cycle, right? Are you running current versions of software and leveraging a modern technology approach to solve these problems, or, are you just, keeping something going, basically? So I think those are viable considerations. But the key, I think, is really just leveraging your roadmap and focusing on those outcomes and objectives that you define, which includes your programs, right? Your program should define not only just what objectives and outcomes you want to achieve, but what are your SLAs? How do you want to structure the operating model to accomplish those things? And
your risk profile equates to the requirements for all these solutions as well. So, part of the concept of the ecosystem is to make sure that you understand what the roadmaps are for each of those solutions, and whether those vendors or solution providers are investing to keep up with those evolving threats as well as there's, as everyone knows, there's tons of consolidation going on within this market or industry. So, why pay for something twice if someone's adding functionality or acquiring something that then there's overlap in your portfolio? So that's where it has to be something that you're constantly managing to make sure it's meeting all those requirements.
Right. So these decision points never really go away, right? Sometimes buying technology that does one thing really, really well is better than buying a suite that does a lot of things, pretty well, right? But sometimes buying a suite and having that ecosystem is beneficial, and I think it's really critical to understand. And again, if we can tie it back to quantifying risk, you get a real live view into the economic impact of doing certain things, and depending on how your roadmap is structured, if you're doing part of the solution in year one and the other part you're not doing until year three, then just based on the economic impact, then having individual solutions might be more beneficial in that case. But so the answer net is it depends, right? But you really have to leverage and go through the steps, I think, to truly understand.
Actively manage that.
That's right, and actively manage that. So step number 4 is, operationalizing it, and this is really taking a look at your operations, not just from a, hands on the keyboard standpoint, but do you have the right expertise? Do you have the right capacity? Is it part of your core business? Is it an area of your business that you want to expand on, right? So in other words, do you want to add headcount to make sure that you have the right expertise and capacity? Or do you just want to transfer the risk or outsource, right? So I think the key for me is that the operational aspects of a solution, they have to meet the criteria that's established in the program, right? So when you build that roadmap and you evaluate your operations, you have to evaluate it from the perspective the operations have to meet the critical objectives of the program. And we actually have a working example in vulnerability management, but the net of it is, if your SLA says that you can't have a vulnerability that's that exists longer than 30 days or 45 days, you can't run scans once a quarter.
Right.
So from an operational aspect, you have to make sure that you have the capacity to do things more frequently and accommodate those types of things, if that's what the business decides is critical, right?
That all becomes part of the operational component of understanding what the requirements are to not only implement a solution, but operate it going forward,
right,
so you can meet those SLAs and business requirements or compliance requirements. Again, sometimes those are synonymous with each other.
Right.
So one question, you introduced the concept in that last bullet of transferring the risk. What are you really talking about there? That's something that we haven't really talked about in detail.
Yep, and actually I thought about including a slide about the treatments of risk, but really there's only 3 ways. You either accept a risk And what that means is you don't do anything about it, right? The cost of the risk is less than the cost of remediating it or adding it to your cyber insurance, right? Or you remediate it, and that means you go, you pay to put a tool in place, build a program, and operationalize it, right? So all of those costs in your roadmap, that's what your roadmap really accomplishes, is building that operating model for those risks that you're going to remediate, right? So you make them go away, or you lessen the likelihood by putting solutions in so that it affects your exposure and those kind of things. And the third option is transferring the risk. And one of the mechanisms for doing that is cyber insurance. And so that's what we really mean by doing that.
That's an interesting concept because, I don't know if everyone really looks at cyber insurance in that way. That's where, really understanding what your profile is allows you to potentially make some of those decisions.
Right. And so this is an element of holistic security that's often left out of the conversation, right? Because I think in a lot of enterprises, insurance is not even handled by the cyber team, right? It's not part of the cyber group. And they may have input, but it's probably not a stretch to assume that a lot of people in cyber or practitioners of security don't really understand what policies are in place or where the protections are, various different things. But we look at it as a tool. So if you're truly practicing holistic security, you have to consider the whole, right? Holistic is about the whole, and cyber insurance should be one mechanism that you leverage to manage risk. And so in the treatment of risk, one of the options is transferring that risk. Some enterprises carry risk on their balance sheet, for example. That's transferring risk. And so instead of spending dollars or capital or resources to remediate a risk, they just ride it out and hope it doesn't happen, but if it does, it's a balance sheet item, and so then they have to pay for the costs of an exposure or those kind of things, or a compromise. But the other way is transferring it to cyber insurance. And some of the questions I think that enterprises should be asking are basically, is your policy tied to the actual risk posture of your enterprise, or is it like a one size fits all? And I think that a lot of the insurance carriers are really trying to figure out, how to understand cyber as well, right? And just, these are risk takers. These are professional risk takers that is their trade, right? And so they know how to measure and monitor risk for a lot of different types of scenarios, but cyber is one of those things that it's complex and it's a little difficult to understand. And I think that by virtue of that, there are insurers who are writing policies who may not, you may not actually be covered in the event that something happens, right? So you might get a cheap policy or an inexpensive policy, relatively speaking, but then if there is ever an event, your insurers, they don't want to pay money, right? They benefit by not paying money. They don't benefit by paying money. And so they'll be looking for ways that you did something wrong or,
and part of that process is, whether the policy that you have is aligned to your risk profile, one, and then second is that one size fits all comment. Why should you pay for everything that everyone else is not doing?
Right.
So if you have invested in remediating your risk or accepting some cases certain risks, that should be able to be communicated to an insurance provider or reinsurer so that you're not paying for everyone's poor hygiene or cyber hygiene.
That's exactly right. And a lot of times I use healthcare as an example to explain this principle, right? In healthcare, a lot of times the policies, the value of the policy is established by how many medical records you store, right? So a company that stores 1 million medical records and has a bad security hygiene is probably the same cost as a company that stores 1 million records and has a good security hygiene, right? And so, and that's
right.
And how is that right? And so, what I think a key element to a holistic approach, and particularly quantifying cyber, who's willing to go there with you and understands that quantified risk model and those kind of things. So great point. I have an example, and it's almost quarter till, so I think we probably can go through this pretty quickly. I'm going to talk really fast. And Frank and I talk about this going in. We have some material, but I think an example really helps bring some of these concepts home. But I want to make sure that we save enough time for Q&A. So that said, there are a couple key parts of this data metric that I think are important to understand. So what we're going to use for the example is it's one of the basic CIS controls. It's control number 3. And basically what that means is that you should be doing this, right? It's a basic control, and everybody knows they should be doing vulnerability management. But the thing that's scary to me is that it takes an average of 100 days for known security vulnerabilities to get remediated in an enterprise environment. Yet it only takes 15 days on average for a vulnerability to be exploited. So there's a huge gap in the amount of time that it takes enterprises to remediate a vulnerability and the amount of time it takes attackers to leverage vulnerabilities to find a way into the network. But that said, so if you look at the vulnerability management lifecycle, and this is a slide that I borrowed from Rapid7, one of our partners, but I think it's a good slide because it touches on a lot of the different key elements of vulnerability management in general, not just scanning and reviewing the data, right, but also patching and remediating the issues, and then addressing the out-of-cycle issues. There are third-party products, and there are all kinds of things that are running in our environments that may be externally facing, yada, 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 that they don't happen on a regular patch cycle. They're out of band, and they need to be addressed. Operationalizing it, right? So reviewing and validating the SLAs and making sure that you have an operational model that ties back to the things that you're trying to accomplish. Measuring success or failure, so evaluation. But you have to govern the process, right? Are your people actually doing the things that your program says you ought to be doing? If you don't have a governance model in place, then how would you ever know if you were or not, right? So I think it's key to it, identify those things. But so let's just say that in this example, we did a baseline assessment, and you take a survey, and you explain that yes, we're doing vulnerability management. We have a scanner, we have a program, we have all those things. So check, right? But then when we do the internal scan, we find vulnerabilities in your environment, right? So, or if we review your scanner data and those kind of things, right? So there are vulnerabilities there. So there's disparity. You're saying that you have a program, and then we find vulnerabilities. So we sit down at the table and we have a discussion, right? It turns out that, okay, so we do have a scanning platform in place, but it's difficult to keep up with remediation. And then our program really doesn't address strict SLAs and guidelines for classifying and remedying vulnerabilities. So it's hard for our people to understand what they ought to work on first and those types of things. But these are very real scenarios, right? We see these things often. So then we set out to build a program. We actually review your SLAs and various different things. And we find out that it could use a little bit of work. So we work with you to define some SLAs, and we come up with the following, using the CVSS values that your vulnerability scanner leverages. We don't want any highs or criticals for more than 45 days, no mediums for more than 90, or no lows for more than 180. And so then we have to operationalize the program. But it turns out that there aren't dedicated resources allocated to this. So the same people that keep the lights on in the organization, they have to run backups, they got to do all the other IT roles. These are the guys that are remediating the vulnerabilities. Just aren't enough resources to accomplish the SLAs, right? Turns out you're only scanning quarterly, which doesn't work for these SLAs, right? You got an SLA that says it can't go past 45 days, and you're only scanning every 120 or 90 days or whatever the case may be. So currently only performing patches for remediation. There's no sandbox in place for testing remediation, so you don't know when things are going to break and all those other things. Again, a very real scenario. So the question that I like to ask is, should you change the SLAs? Like, hey, we don't have any more resources. Maybe we should change our SLAs so we can keep scanning quarterly. And that's not really the approach. That's not really the approach that you should take, right? You should build a playbook that addresses these operational challenges, right? So the key to building a program is defining what the organization needs, whether it's driven by client contracts, by compliance requirements, regulatory requirements, or various other things that might drive your SLAs. if you establish that you need to clear 4s and 5s, you know, the highs and very high critical vulnerabilities in 45 days or less, don't change the SLA. Change your operating model, right? So if you don't have enough resources, you have to either add headcount or outsource the role, right? So these are the kinds of decisions I think that leveraging this process help companies, establish, right? Again, it's a gap-based. Here's where we are. Here's where we want to be. This is the program and the SLAs. Where are our gaps? We don't have the resources. We don't scan often enough in those kind of things.
Well, and part of that component of that as well is going back to the remediate piece, specifically on the investments that you might be making, is to allow you to demonstrate the value that you've achieved by implementing those doing those investments and adding those solutions. So that's another component of this, is that you always want to be in sync with the business. One of the things that, again, you can look at is how you tie the this type of approach into your fiscal year business cycle. So another component of this is to make sure that, one, you understand that gap going into your fiscal year planning process, get to the point where you can demonstrate what your risks are, decide what you want to remediate, what you want to transfer in the sense of your cyber insurance policy, and then what has to be on the balance sheet to allow you to budget for those. And then as you define what the roadmap is for your particular fiscal year, going through the process of then validating when you've done those investments, implemented those, completed those projects, how that's changed your risk profile, and demonstrate the ROI that you're getting on those investments, as well as potentially even refreshing your cyber insurance policy to reflect those investments as well. So it's that kind of continuously managing that risk that allows you to achieve those goals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's open it up for some questions. I'll toggle to the next thing. I want to make sure that that we have a chance to address all the questions that we have. So let's see, we've got one that says, what do you see as the number one issue in cybersecurity at the enterprise level? That's a great question. Boy, if you asked 100 people, there might be 100 different answers. But to me, and particularly as it relates to, building a holistic program, one of the biggest challenges I see that's pretty pervasive, I think, across the market is this point solution mentality. And it isn't that security practitioners don't know better. I hear a lot of times, the business doesn't really understand me, right? So why did they say we had to deploy the solution? They don't really understand what our needs are. And, to me, it all goes back to speaking the language of the business. Maybe the business would understand if we were able to communicate to them in terms that they would understand. And so it all kind of compounds and manifests as a big blob of challenge, right? But the challenge is that there isn't a common language for cyber to speak to the business that results in, I think, a point solution approach, right? A reactionary model to whatever the latest and greatest thing is, like make sure we have it in, EDR, endpoint detect and respond, right? Boom. Okay. Somebody says, do it, right? Put it in. We have to have that solution. Well, what if there's other risk that could potentially cost your business more than adding another agent or another piece of detection to your endpoints, right? It doesn't mean that EDR solutions are bad. It just means it may not be your highest priority based on where you're currently at and where your appetite is. So the number one problem that I see in enterprises is not taking the time to really evaluate from that perspective. And it's that lack of holistic approach, quite honestly.
Well, and part of that too is, and that this is where that, having the quantification helps, is you can put the governance in place so that you have representation at the table with either some type of steering committee or with the board or the C-suite, depending on the profile of your organization, and having that visibility and being able to have those types of conversations so that the first time someone hears about something is not when a risk occurs, but basically, or an incident, but basically you're having those ongoing conversations so that all cards are on the table. There's no question, what the profile of the organization is, and that you're tracking against some type of plan versus just reacting to, incidents that may be occurring or just things that, as we talked earlier, that someone reads about in the paper or online.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here's a similar question, Frank. How do you prioritize initiatives and determine which get done when, right? And I think one of the promises that we made up front was, wouldn't it be great if the business understood, what you were going to implement, when you were going to implement it, and why you were going to implement it, right? So how do you know what to do and when?
Well, it goes back to that whole prioritization. I mean, unless you have some sense of how the risk profile of your organization translates into the impact on the profile of your risk translates into the impact that it has on your organization, it's difficult to know how to prioritize anything. So, again, you have to look at, the current state, understanding where you might have to do some catch up to remediate some potential risks, but then also, understanding what the business plans are. What are the strategic goals of the business? Where are there growth from a geographic perspective that may change the governmental requirements that you have to meet? Those tie into the prioritization, as well as even things like acquisitions or divestitures. So those are all things that you have to have continued conversations on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the M&A piece is interesting. If I go down a little bit of a tangent, because we all probably have examples. I mean, Verizon, Yahoo is a good example, right? How the value of a transaction was impacted by a breach, right? By a poor security posture that got exploited, right?
Doing the due diligence to really understand what their cyber hygiene was,
right,
before going through that business transaction.
Right, right. And to me, that's probably an area that historically hasn't been addressed adequately, in my opinion, right? Even evaluating cyber, IT evaluation or due diligence as part of an M&A activity historically has been kind of tied to accounting practices.
That would be a whole.
We could do a segment on that.
That would be a great conversation to have.
Right. But so you could easily tie that into the quantified risk, though, if you're engaged in M&A activity or
due diligence process, exactly.
Wouldn't it be nice to understand the economic impact to the security, to the exposure?
Have some very factual discussions about what that means.
That's right. And versus the cost of remediating, right?
Right.
So now you can actually have an intelligent discussion and make business decisions based on real data.
Right.
Very interesting. So here's a question. Isn't this just proactive versus reactive IT and security? I can start on this, Frank, if you want, but this is a great question because my short answer would be yes. Right? This isn't a novel idea. The concept of quantifying cyber risk might be relatively new, but the concept of holistic security certainly isn't. And I think maybe there are no new or original ideas. Maybe everything is repurposed, right? So that I think the difference, though, the difference with what we're talking about is really just moving away from that reactive model into a more proactive model. So again, it probably is that same discussion, but where I get really excited today is that there are tools available to us right now to actually do that. And it's a great opportunity, in my opinion. But if you, and again, I probably said it 100 times, quantifying cyber risk, but when you can actually create a common language with the business and express yourself to the business in a way that the business understands, the chance of success goes way up, right? And if the business can't understand what you're talking about, there is no real chance of success. So I think that the difference really is that by speaking the language of the business, I honestly don't think holistic security is possible without that.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Things have evolved. Look at the pace of change that's occurring with the whole concept of continuous delivery or app improvement from an application perspective. I mean, the business has evolved to the point where, it's security has to be able to keep up, and that means having the ability to truly tie back how to, keep up with the priorities, keep the focus on the risks that are relevant to the business, and then making sure you have the ability to invest in those things.
Yep. So I want to be respectful of time. We're getting close to the top of the hour. I think we have time for one more question, so I'll fire this off, and then we have a couple of announcements to make before everybody leaves. But so Frank, how do you account for compliance requirements, especially with rapidly evolving privacy laws? So the compliance requirements are changing at a very fast pace, right? How do you address that from a priority standpoint?
Part of that process is, again, having, something like the CIS controls as a foundation, and then layering on top of that the privacy or regulatory requirements that are applicable to your business. And that's something that, again, is just, you have to have the awareness of what those are, keeping up with those, and then, something like the capability of integrating like the AI machine learning into that model, where it actually keeps up with the actual breaches that are occurring and the changing requirements. Because again, like we talked about earlier, why not start applying the technology that's going to help,
right,
everyone as security practitioners to complete the job that they have been asked to do for your organization. You have to be able to use those contemporary tools.
Yep, I agree. And I might add that, controls mapping, right? This is one of the ways that we would deal and account for compliance requirements is mapping the controls that are part of the compliance framework to the framework that we leverage to do our baseline assessment or deeper dive in the enterprise risk and various different things. And again, we could spend an entire webinar on the quantified risk, and we do and we will. So more to come on that. But the other thing is that I think our goal in this is to really keep it as simple as possible. And so being able to adjust, if somebody's already done an assessment for a compliance requirement or some regulatory requirement, FFIEC if you're in financial services or yada yada, whatever the case may be, right? HIPAA, high trust if you're in healthcare and those kind of things. We want to be able to leverage that and map the controls back to our controls, but also, leverage the data, right? If you're already doing it, and so you obviously have enough to do. And I want to thank everybody for for their time, and I have a couple more slides if I could figure out how to do it. Let's see here. Okay. So I just wanted to talk real quick. We have a webinar series that we're planning, Frank, and I think it's worth noting as part of this. So holistic security and quantified risk is really the arch, I think, but our vision is to do webinars for all of the CIS top 20 controls, and we're in the process of working through those schedules. But we have solutions for and technology partners and very respected members of the industry that we can bring to the table for these webinars, and so we're in the process of doing that, and I think we've probably got 3 or 4 of those pretty well defined.
Right. Yeah, and the best option is to follow ASMGi on our social media channels, as well as our website, our resources page, where we refresh that with both the on-demand content for previous webinars, as well as the upcoming schedule as well. So that's an excellent resource for tracking, if you found this beneficial, then please follow us on all those channels.
Yep. And the links are listed here on this slide, but I will reiterate that these slides will all be available for download, and a follow-up email will have the link to download the slides and the presentation and all those other things. So the last thing I wanted to do was just, I think it's worth highlighting that, we recognize that the whole AI and ML thing is relatively new, and some people may be saying, what is an actual quantified risk result looks like? or, how do I know how you're actually calculating that? Is it real? Is it hocus pocus? We did a webinar on that and various different other things. Here's the thing. I feel so strongly about this. This is the right way to go about doing security. We want to make a special offer for the people that are on the webinar today, and just follow up with Frank or myself. We'll do a baseline assessment at no cost. And what you basically get from a baseline assessment is a quantified output that we can review with you, and we can answer those very detailed questions about how did you do this and how did you do that. We can bring insurance quotes to the table that you can compare with what you're currently doing and various different things. I think there are a lot of ways that we can leverage that, to move things forward and help people start being more holistic about their security programs right now. And so that offer is available. And again, this slide will be part of the deck that's published, but get a hold of Frank or get a hold of myself, and we'd be happy to have a conversation about how to execute on this. Anything to add to that, Frank?
No, we'd love the opportunity to have those further conversations and help you apply this concept or approach to your individual organization. So definitely would love the opportunity to have those discussions. And as it notes at the last bullet, if you're preparing for your fiscal year, if you're on a calendar year fiscal year, the timing couldn't be better to start that process so you can begin budgeting for next year and be prepared to have those conversations with your management.
Right. No, that's a great point. Actually, if you are entering a budget cycle, now it's a great time to get a perspective that quantifies the risk that's right in front of you, and maybe you can leverage that to influence
why
your
not?
budget.
Why wouldn't you want to consider that?
Why wouldn't you want to do that? So, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you found this useful. Thank you, Frank, for your wisdom and participating, and thanks again for everybody for being on. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.